¿Para qué quiero un recuerdo que me llena de dolor? Ya no quiero ver tu rostro. ¿Y por qué llorando estoy?
The idea of race has perpetuated ignorance in the minds of the masses for millennia. What is race? Black and white? Yellow and brown? Or far more complex than what we've been taught to think? When someone refers to a white person, are they referring to a Caucasian or a European? When someone refers to a black person, are they referring to a Negro or African? Each one of these so-called classifications is an indoctrinated establishment of social disposition based upon the false concept of race and color. Take Kamala Harris, for example, who is ethnically a Caucasian woman but can socially pass for black, and does so. On the opposite end of the spectrum, anyone of a lighter skin and so-called European admixture can easily pass for white. Yet all of these terms are inaccurate and misleading. Caucasian doesn't mean white any more than Negro means black. Dark-skinned Mongoloids and Caucasians exist, as well as fair-skinned Negroes. Although one would be extremely hard-pressed to find a light-skinned Australoid, if an Australoid male had pale skin, he would resemble an archaic European. So the idea of a dark-skinned European isn't far-fetched from a genetic or anthropological standpoint. The main features that differentiate the Australoid from the European are the wider jaw, the wider nose, the deeper eye set, and the prominent brow ridge, and of course, skin color. Whereas the Melanesian and Negrito groups in the Pacific more closely resemble so-called Negroes, but surprisingly have the least relation to them, and have the highest amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. The groups in Oceania are some of the oldest and most genetically isolated in the world. They are also the genetic personification of what a Caucasian once resembled. Taking this into mind, the assertion that race and color should be used synonymously is asinine. Equally as asinine would be to label an African as black or a European as white. Race is a direct result of bloodline, and color has been used to conflate the truth. In terms of anthropology, the race labeled as white is an extremely brand new so-called race of people. Even using the inflated chronology of academia that includes millions of years for Australopithecus to evolve into modern human, the inception of the so-called white race materialized overnight in comparison. According to the accepted history of pigmentation in Eurasia, the origin of both light skin and blue eyes is south of the Caucasus, more specifically in modern-day Iran, former Mesopotamia. While blonde hair originated as a Siberian feature. It must be noted that blue eyes originated thousands of years before light skin, as stated in the outline. The ancient race of France had dark skin and blue eyes. The ancient Baltic races had dark skin and blue or variable eyes, while many more of these people were considered swarthy with light-colored eyes. Light or white skin came later as a result of artificial selection. According to genetic studies, pale skin is a result of several waves of selective breeding. Cited in a number of academic journals, pale skin comes as a result of interbreeding between a small, finite group of people from south of the Caucasus and Anatolia, who then migrated into the surrounding areas. Additionally, this information stands directly in the face of the generally accepted school of thought, which states skin tone and UV radiation based upon geographic latitude act as the dominant factor in skin complexion. Because if the latter were completely true, one should have expected the white race to come out of Scandinavia or even Antarctica rather than Mesopotamia. In reality, this model shows the creation of one people and the removal of another in a relatively short amount of time. The term white person did not exist in Europe, Asia, Africa, or even pre-Columbian America. The term white came about in the late 1600s as a method of differentiation between indentured servants and slaves from the general populace. White became a term of classification, meaning European and free. European meaning one of several sovereign nationalities, indistinguishable by skin color. The meaning of free being indistinguishable by skin color as well. This white mysticism stands at the foundation of world deception. Many of those so-called lauded white faces of royalty from world history are anything but. And the desolate face of slavery in Eurasia was exclusively white, as the Caucasus is the headquarters of world slavery. So by the time of the first conquistadors, this racial transition still had not taken place, but was under progressive transformation over the following centuries to come. The colonization of the Americas ran contemporaneous with the Renaissance period in Europe. The Renaissance followed the Middle Ages, and the fall of the Middle Ages can best be described as a massive transformation in the demographics of Europe. Ironically named the Black Death, was the leading cause of this massive change in European demographic, which it is said that over 75 to 200 million died as a result of this human-enabled plague. As maintained by the leading evolutionary epidemiologists, the origin of the Black Plague hails from either Crimea in modern-day Ukraine or the Genoese-Italian slave ships that traveled from Atlantic coast to Black Sea coast, carrying infected rats whose parasitic fleas were the incubators for the bubonic plague. This was actually the second collapse of the Middle Ages. The Great Famine of 1315 already had an extremely overcrowded Europe struggling to maintain survival. It is estimated that as much as 25% of the entire population of Europe died during this time preceding the Black Death. Continuous precipitation and wet conditions rendered the land unharvestable, and the people were rendered to cannibalism. Between these two calamities, the famine and the plague, Europe was ripe for a drastic change in demographics. The art of the Renaissance reflected this drastic change in demographic by manufacturing works of art that were said to be a rebirth or rediscovery of classical antiquity. Apparently, before the Renaissance, the art of drawing with perspective and even the ability to make concrete had either been long forgotten or recently discovered. In truth, the Renaissance period transpired as a consummation for the rebranding of European and world history. During this time, so-called new advances were introduced to the public, mainly by the Italians, through art, mathematics, philosophy, science, astronomy, and even naval technology. The Renaissance in Europe is a first-hand outcome of the Age of Discovery, led by the Portuguese and Spanish by way of Italy into the falsely attributed New World. The concept of race based upon color is void at this moment. We can only surmise that over the span of time between the Middle Ages and the year 1700, a people arose with distinguishably white European characteristics. At no point earlier in the accepted historical narratives across the world have any people been characterized as such. If such a people did exist, they existed in complete isolation from the entire world until after the Age of Discovery. Which means that many of the American lands conquered by so-called white men were actually subdued by darker races, and white people came later. It was only around the year 1700 did this qualification define itself in a way as to not compromise the identity of the classically accepted European. Under whatever circumstances, the conditions in Europe caused by the famine and plague facilitated the prospects for this specific group of people to spread throughout Europe, effectively supplanting the darker Europeans with their pale-skinned proto-cousins. The possibility lies well within the crosshairs of credibility that this race or type of people were purposely created by people of a darker race to execute a specific objective. The conditions needed to conceive this genetic grouping were well controlled, lending its nature to a source of artificial design, meaning this group was selected for and breeded against as recently as 500 years ago. So the application of the word white has no historical bearing that can be consistently established over a significant course of time. With this being said, the study of Torah as a means of tracing genealogy and identity is far more viable than the duplicitous world of modified knowledge, otherwise known as science. The areas of speculation have definable associations, in the words of Scripture. The families and territories in question have definable roots, according to the Word. So far, we've highlighted the territories of Japheth and Ham, and throughout our findings, we uncovered the ancient bloodlines responsible for ruling certain areas throughout Eurasia and Africa. In this episode, we uncover the lands of Shem through the investigation of migration, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics. First beginning with Canada and continuing down into South America, followed later by Central America and the Caribbean, and closing next episode with Mexico and the United States.
Mali Masigana, Axel Kush.
couple spots that gave me a push. Creek Apache, Navajo, Maya, Paiute. Gave me the type of blood you cannot dilute. Don't mess with beats if I can find a loop. My history is a circle that you cannot dispute. Study Shaka Zulu, how we handled the troops. Broke everything that his enemy was planning to do. This ain't pride talking, I'm examining it too. Simple facts that some people can't handle the truth. Your genetics is a prophecy handed to you. Better deal with it before it starts handling you. And walk tall like you know it then. I study history. I know we got this shit on repeat. I know we got this shit on repeat. I know you got this shit on repeat. I know you got this shit on repeat.
The line of Shem, otherwise known as the line of the blessed, is the most important lineage of all as it concerns the history of the Old Testament and the world. Within this lineage, the truth of identity threatens every foundation of academically accepted knowledge the world over. The fields of history, law, philosophy, science, and math even sit on the fringes of truth if the mysteries of the book are persistently studied and uncovered. The most simple context is lost if the knowledge is founded in wickedness or ignorance. And for this reason was the lineage of Shem so important. In simple, this ancestry was entrusted with the most vital responsibility of the sons of Noah: to maintain and uphold the true knowledge, history, and wisdom of the ages. And to sustain a code of morality and ethics passed down through the righteous sons of Adam. The line of Shem has several different confusing elements that on the surface may not be so apparent under the classical school of biblical thought. Most importantly, all Shemites are not Israelites. Additionally, all Ishmaelites should be considered Shemites. But Shemites would also include every generation from Shem to Jacob and all the sons that came forth in between those generations. So the idea of a modern-day Arab being a Shemite is not too far from the truth. Also, chronologically, the sons of Shem can be split into two separate lines, the line of Joktan, pre-Babel, and the line of Peleg, post-Babel. But the confusion about this ancestry doesn't only lie here, it lies within Shem himself. The first mention of Shem in the King James Version is at the end of Genesis chapter 5, which says that Noah was 500 years old and begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This verse brings us to our first major issue of concern as it is related to Shem. When was Shem born? This issue seems to complicate itself as we read into chapters 10 and 11. Before moving forward, it's important to make explicit notice. The generations of Shem have been separated between chapter 10 and chapter 11. The most effective way of distinguishing these two lines is by using chronology as it relates to the narrative of the tower. For example, the sons of Shem in chapter 10 only mention the sons of Joktan after the children of Eber. But more importantly, the end of the chapter tells us that these were the lands, nations, and tongues that the earth had been divided into. Although the opening verse in chapter 11 seems to contradict the end of chapter 10 because it states that the earth was of one language and of one speech. Nonetheless, the sons of Joktan are mentioned before the narrative of the tower. By this placement in the text, we could only presume these populations attended their inherited lot prior to the events of chapter 11. But even that presumption could be misleading. Keeping this in mind, We particularly want to extract the point from this example that exclusively the sons of Joktan are mentioned in chapter 10. Before we compare and contrast this lineage with the Aramaic translation and the Septuagint, let's dive deeper into the context of the verses as they are written in the King James Version. Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber. Again, the word also was placed within the text for a very important reason. The brother of Japheth, the elder. Who was the elder? By the simple placement of the comma, this could mean two different things. A comma after Japheth implies Japheth is the elder, but the comma after elder implies what? Even unto him children were born. Once more, we have an example of a word being inserted that could change the context of the statement. In this case, the word being even. Even unto him children were born. Using these instances, the word also and even the word even, meaning in addition to, the more imperative question being in addition to what? Or in this case, in addition to whom? Furthermore, why does the text add that Shem is the father of all the children of Eber? Verse 24 says, Arphaxad begot Salah, and Salah begot Eber. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Let's stop here. How many children did Eber have? Verse 25 says, Unto Eber were born two sons, making a numerical signification and a literal documentation to the account of two sons by the name of Joktan and Peleg. Chapter 10 opens and closes with the recognition of the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Keeping this in mind, chapter 11 opens with the tower and ends the complete narrative in verse 9. Immediately after the tower narrative, verse 10 opens with, These are the generations of Shem. Why is the text seemingly repeating the same information that was presented in the previous chapter? The next part of the verse is providing the reader with an extremely important detail as to the true identity of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. This detail may seem insignificant on the surface, but anyone with a developing understanding of the parallel plot devices at play has learned the conditions for discernment are beyond subterranean. Remember, chapter 5, verse 32 clearly states that Shem was born when Noah was 500 years old, and the flood came in Noah's 599th or 600th year. So how could Shem be 100 years old 2 years after the flood if the flood came in Noah's 599th or 600th year? If Shem is the same son that was born when Noah was 500 years old, then there is no way to reconcile this inconsistency. Either the text is wrong, or there are indeed two Shems. Investigating the generations of Shem in chapter 11, there is another literary inconsistency that can only strengthen the reality of parallel Shems. This regarding Eber, who in chapter 10 is documented as having two sons, Peleg and Joktan. But how many sons did the Eber in chapter 11 have? Verse 16 says, Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. And Eber lived after he got Peleg 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Is this the same Eber that was mentioned in the previous chapter? If so, then where is the mention of Joktan? And even more importantly, how many sons did this Eber have? The Eber in chapter 10 has 2 sons, and the Eber in chapter 11 has more than 3 by the usage of the phrase, and begot sons and daughters, implying that he had at least 2 more sons after he begot Peleg. Once again, this could be 1 or 2 or many more unseen things. Either the text is wrong or the Eber mentioned in chapter 11 is different from the Eber mentioned in chapter 10, which wouldn't only mean there are 2 Shems, but possibly even 2 Ebers. Comparing translations. When we first compare this section of Genesis to the Greek Septuagint, one considerable name is missing from the line of Shem altogether. And to Shem himself also were children born, the father of all the sons of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder, the sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, Aram, and Canaan. Conspicuously, the Septuagint lists Canaan as a son of Shem. But this name is missing from the King James Version completely. According to the Septuagint, Arphaxad begot Canaan, and Canaan begot Salah, and Salah begot Eber. This disparity in order may cause inconsistency in the listed chronologies of the patriarchs. How is this issue resolved in the text by the writers? And what other differences are there between the 2 texts in these particular chapters? Continuing down to the end of the chapter, most of the information seems consistent with the King James Version, except for another very key detail. The word Gentiles is used in verse 32 in the Septuagint, where the word nations is used in the 1611 King James. Continuing in the Septuagint, the text also seems mostly consistent with the King James Version, with 2 exceptions. First, in verse 6, the text is different in each version because of the use of one word, race. And the Lord said, behold, there is one race and one lip of all. Yet the King James omits the word race altogether. So now the verse reads, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. The fact that all these people who were involved in the construction of the tower were of one race should provide a stark visual reality of the true situation. No matter what race one believes these people were at the time, the truth is they were one single race acting in unison with the sole purpose of blasphemy. And secondly, in the King James Version, it states, therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. However, in the Septuagint, Babel is called confusion. In the generations of Shem, there are several inconsistencies. Firstly, when Arphaxad was 35 years old, he begot Salah, his firstborn, according to the King James. But the Septuagint instead says that Arphaxad was 135 when he begot Canaan, and Canaan was 130 when he begot Salah. Due to these contradictions, the ages of the patriarchs do not match between the King James and the Septuagint. Now, looking at the Aramaic translation for more insight into these verses, we can see the chapter 10 sons of Shem section listed more consistently with the King James Version, with the omission of the name Canaan from the text. However, two important points made in the Targum that were left out of both the King James and the Septuagint are in reference to Elmodad and Shalef, sons of Joktan. This text says Elmodad measured the earth with lines, and Shalef led forth waters of rivers. At the end of chapter 10, there is no mention of Gentiles, only that the people of the earth are distinguished after these houses. Chapter 11 in the Targum opens up similarly to the previous two examples, with one major clue omitted from both. According to the Targum, the one language the people spoke was the same language in which the world had been created at the beginning. The power of speech is a force of creation, as highlighted in chapter 1 of Genesis. And this section will definitely heighten our understanding of the phrase, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And the Lord said to the 70 angels which stand before him, "Come, we will descend and will commingle their language, that a man shall not understand the speech of his neighbor." And the word of the Lord was revealed against the city, and with him 70 angels, having reference to 70 nations, each having its own language, and thence the writing of its own hand. And he dispersed them from thence upon the face of all the earth into 70 languages. And this is a very important omission from the King James and Septuagint. There is no reference to 70 angels, nations, or languages. Why was this essential literature left out of the text? And can this number of 70 be cross-referenced? When looking deeper into Genesis 10, the connection has been made that the 70 nations mentioned in this section of the Aramaic translation are directly related to the names mentioned in Genesis 10 as the grandsons of Noah. This number is also corroborated in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, when the 70 elders are chosen to represent each nation during the Exodus. Here we can see a literary parallel between the scatter from the tower and the exodus from Egypt to Canaan by the usage of the number 70 to represent the nations. This number of significance can also be substantiated in chapter 9 in the book of Jasher. And of course, within the book of Jasher, we get even more confusion as to the age of Noah at the birth of Shem. Additionally, the age of Lamech at the time of his death. Did Lamech die at age 777 or age 770? And was Shem born when Noah was 500 or when Noah was 502? The Beringia theory, one of science's many false theories, asserts that the first people to inhabit the Americas were migrants who traveled across the Bering Strait from Asia to Alaska and are originally of Siberian origin. This is a major fabrication being perpetuated by the so-called elite of academia. Its purposes are founded in Eurasian centrism and control through deception. Every depiction of an Indigenous American propagated by these institutions of deceit across the board is of Asian or Mongoloid ancestry. This historical perjury is a product of the prominent families of Eurasia to distort, conceal, and falsify the true history of ancient America, fraudulently entitled the New World. Yet, throughout this study, we will highlight the fact that the Americas were not only populated by millions of historically unaccounted for people, but the arrival of Siberian DNA to the Americas is well documented on multiple separate occasions from 250 to 1,000 years ago. The introduction of alternative DNA into the American landscape would provide the perfect mechanism to which modern geneticists could use to confound the true history of the Old World. As mentioned in earlier episodes, the Vikings, who were of Mongoloid and Caucasian ancestry, are documented to have reached northern Canada as well as intermingled with the Inuit people. For those who are unaware, the Vikings can be best described as merchant raiders, predominantly men that invaded areas in many cases for the purposes of taking women. The Thule people, who are considered the ancestors to the Inuit people, are recorded with several settlements in these exact same areas at the exact same time. This culture appears to have resettled this territory after another people mysteriously disappeared. Tagged as the Dorset people, geneticists say this group has no history of genetic admixture between them and the Vikings or the Inuit, suggesting these people had been replaced. However, geneticists also say the ancestry of this group is predominantly haplogroup D, a descendant of haplogroup M. This denotes Paleo-Siberian or Asian ancestry. According to Inuit legend, the Dorset people were giants, but also non-violent. A common misnomer about the idea of Asian or even Siberian genealogy. Most people strongly associate these people with East Asians, specifically Chinese, because of its dominant populace on the continent. But rather, the Siberian moniker should be more closely associated with Russian or Tartarian rather than Chinese or East Asian. Additionally, the Siberian can be phenotypically seen as a combination of Turkic and Mongoloid features. These Siberian groups, who are fraudulently labeled as the first people to inherit the Americas, hailed from specific locations in Asia, which have strong genetic points of origin. And the dominant point of origin for the so-called Native American is Russia, the former land of Tartary in the territory of Siberia. If we were to look at our notes on the families from Genesis 10 and the location of certain bloodlines, we are led to a legitimate conclusion: the line of Japheth, more specifically Magog and Meshech, whose inherited lands are the areas in question. The details surrounding these houses and their deception and wickedness can be cataloged in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. The invasion by these houses was written and prophesied. In addition, the chapter is telling the Son of Man to prophesy against Gog, the land of Magog, and the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, informing them that the Lord is against them. These are the bloodlines that are attributed to the so-called Native Americans: Gog, Magog, Meshech, and Tubal. Yet even still, there is more evidence of this Russian, Siberian, Tartarian colonization in the infamous location of the Bering Sea. It must be highlighted that up until 1842, Alaska was part of Russia. In fact, Russian or Siberian fur traders and hunters had been exploiting the Alaskan coast going back at least until the 1500s. Quote from the Russian fur trade. The Russians were seized with a fur fever, much like gold fever, which possessed the American 49ers of a later century. In Siberia, sables worth 10 to 20 rubies, black foxes worth from 100 to 300 rubies were found. Could a man but obtain a few of them, a single trip would then suffice to enable him to settle down in comfort for the rest of his life. A pauper could become a rich man in one season. To illustrate this, in 1623, a Siberian official reported that Ivan Afanasiev had stolen 2 black fox skins, one valued at 30 rubies, the other at 80 rubies. With these 110 rubies, it has been calculated Ivan could have purchased more than 50 acres of land, erected a good cabin, bought 5 good horses, 10 head of cattle, 20 sheep, and several dozen fowl, and still have had almost half of his capital left over. Some did acquire a plot of land and settle down in Siberia. Others remained there too, either to continue the adventurous wild life of a hunter and trapper, or to carry on trade in one of several towns which arose in this new country. 2 groups of immigrants first appeared in Siberia, drawn there by the fur trade. They were the private enterprisers and the state employees. It was by means of their activities that Siberia was conquered and brought under Russian rule. In the first group, the private enterprisers, 2 types are distinguishable: traders and pромышленniks. The former included merchants or their agents and small traders who sought to avail themselves of the new sources of furs. These traders, more particularly those who became resident in Siberia, sometimes joined the expeditions which went out to conquer new territory. However, their participation in the conquest was perhaps not as extensive as that of the second type, since their business was to acquire furs for sale in the Russian and foreign markets, mainly by exchanging or purchasing them from the pромышленniks. It was the latter who obtained the furs at the source, and for that reason participated actively and extensively in the conquest. The term pромышленniks ordinarily referred to men who worked for themselves, exploiting natural resources. It may also be understood here to include the so-called pokrusheniks, men who worked for an employer but who in all other respects conducted themselves as pромышленniks. The role of pромышленniks is akin to the courrier du bois in Canada. They hunted and trapped fur-bearing animals or got them from natives by trade, extortion, or as tribute. So active were they in the fur trade in Siberia that in the country the term pромышленник became synonymous with fur hunter or trapper. By the very nature of their occupation, they became explorers and conquerors. End quote from the Russian fur trade. It was by this method that these Pramashlinik Russians were able to begin conquering the northwest territories of America. Much of the Asian ancestry in the so-called native population is a result of this invasion long ago, but in comparison to the Beringia theory, not so long ago. Speaking of not so long ago, the French exploration into Canada through the St. Lawrence Seaway in the mid-1500s was of similar motive. On the other side of the continent, fur trapping was just as lucrative of an endeavor for the French. These fur trappers were the first intelligence agents, prospecting military objectives for the empires of Asia and Europe. And of course, trading and trapping between merchants and indigenous people of Canada in areas of Arcadia set the stage for French settlements to pop up centuries before the Louisiana Purchase. In truth, this is a story of a dual invasion of the North from the East and the West territories of North America by the Russians, by the French, and even after the French, the British. Yet this dual invasion of the North is contemporaneous with the dual invasion of the Spanish, Italian, Portuguese to the South. These invasions are the inception of the Cauco-Siberian ancestry that would cloud the true identity of Israel unto this day. The depictions of the so-called indigenous in areas of northern Canada clearly resemble Siberian ancestry, but it is important to note these populations were extremely small and predominantly inhabited the coastal regions on the fringes of continental North America. Remember the phrase, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. Well, the application of this philosophy should be implemented in this case. The people of Europe and Asia were of a darker or swarthier appearance than what we commonly think when we think of an Asian or European today. Although terms like swarthy are used to describe the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spaniards, and even the Russians, one must not confound the word swarthy with indigenous. Using an earlier example, many indigenous Australoid populations are some of the darkest people in the world. In addition, South Asian populations are some of the world's darkest. While populations in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia have features that one would consider African or even American Negro, but in reality, these groups have the highest percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. And this includes the far lighter skinned Caucasian and Siberian Mongoloid. These areas in the Indian and Pacific Oceans have some of the most genetically isolated populations in the world, which means they have retained their phenotypical characteristics over a considerable amount of time compared to other Eurasian populations. With this being said, the Australoid factor plays a far more significant role in South America than the Siberian. Although the Australoid does indeed include Siberian ancestry by way of the Caucasus, from where their forefathers hailed. There has also been a coastal migration theory proposed by geneticists, which states that the Siberian population migrated down the entire Pacific coast all the way to South America. In either case, these academics are referring to the same root population out of the Caucasus. From the official narrative, the Australoid factor isn't a result of conquer or invasion, but rather a result of migration via the South Pacific Highway. The coastal migration model, however, is most widely accepted, which basically asserts the first settlement of the Americas occurred via the Canadian corridor and the Pacific coastline. This assertion is the foundation of which the body of academia stands upon. It is not a stretch to go so far as to propose ourselves that any archaeological discovery that would contradict this model would be stricken from the official record. Also stricken from the record was an apocalyptic catastrophe of biblical proportion, which facilitated the arrival of these new people. Quote from Human Molecular Genetics. Lack of founding Amerindian mitochondrial DNA lineages in extinct aborigines from Tierra del Fuego, Patagonia. Quote, ancient DNA from bones and teeth of 60 individuals from 4 extinct human populations from Tierra del Fuego, Patagonia, amplified by using the polymerase chain reaction. High-resolution analysis of endonuclease restriction, site variation, and mtDNA sequencing of its hypervariable non-coding region revealed complete absence of 2 of the 4 primary mitochondrial haplotype groups present in contemporary Amerins, namely A and B. In contrast, haplogroups C and D were found in all but 1 sample with frequencies of 38% and 60%. These results, together with the decreasing incidence of Group A in more southerly latitudes in the American continent and the absence of Cluster B above 55 degrees north in America and Asia, argue that the first settlers entering America 21,000 to 14,000 years ago already lacked both mtDNA lineages. End quote. This study is essentially highlighting the outcome of their analysis for the Tierra del Fuegan population in the extreme tip of South America. According to their findings, the ancient population of Tierra del Fuego did not have any traces of haplogroups A or B, only haplogroups C and D, which is quite different from much of the so-called Paleo-Indian or Amerindian ancestry, which includes combinations of A, B, C, and D. It's important to note this is a study in mtDNA or mitochondrial DNA, otherwise known as maternal DNA, which is not the same as Y-DNA or paternal DNA. For example, haplogroup A in mitochondrial DNA is East Asian, while in Y-DNA is labeled West African. This study also found that haplogroup A decreases on the South American continent the further southerly you travel, meaning that in the far north part of the continent, the haplogroup is at its highest, and in the southern tip, non-existent. Conversely, the study highlights that haplogroup B is virtually non-existent in areas of Canada north of the 55th parallel. This study leaves with 2 presuppositions concerning the history of the ancient Tierra del Fuego. That the absence of haplogroups A and B in this population could be indicative of migration from the northern founding population, compounded with isolation for thousands of years, resulting in the loss of definitive genetic retention. This study is indicative of a new founding population on the southern tip of South America, as some geneticists propose a multiple out of Asia migrational wave. This has been suggested, according to this study, because the morphological traits of Paleo-Indian fossils and Fuegan Patagonian remains depart from the typical Mongoloid pattern in a number of features. In short, these Asians did not exhibit common phenotypical features associated with the so-called Mongoloid. Unsurprisingly, this study doesn't delve into who these people's features most likely resemble today. And of course, haplogroups C and D are tagged Eurasian groups. As well, haplogroup C is not found in African populations, but is predominant in Kazakhstan, Russia, and Mongolia, as well as Polynesia and Australia. In addition, mitochondrial DNA haplogroup A is deceptively tagged as Asian, while haplogroup A in Y-DNA is mistagged as African. Conversely, the African haplogroup for the so-called mitochondrial Eve is mtDNA haplogroup L, which of course cannot be traced as far back as Y paternal DNA. The African deception being clear at this point must be reiterated. The official scientific narrative persists that the continent of America was first inhabited by Eurasians and no other group of people were already here. The transatlantic African slave trade are the very legs this deception stands upon. There are over 100 million so-called African slave descendants currently inhabiting the Americas. This population is supposedly representative of a total number of 12.5 million African slaves shipped from Africa over the span of approximately 350 years. Of course, we know now this is a mathematic impossibility once we understand the numbers and couple the statistics with a life expectancy under 23 years old and a negative birth rate. The millions of Indigenous Americans mislabeled as Africans were the predominant population on the continent. The exception to this statement being in the colder latitudes above 55 degrees north and roughly 30 degrees south. Not one single academically accepted scientific theory begins with the Indigenous American inhabiting his own land prior to European or Asian contact. Why is that? According to the official slave trade database, over 5.8 million Africans were transported by Portugal into Brazil alone, while Spain is said to be responsible for over 1 million into Uruguay. This total projects over 7 million Africans into South America over that very same span of time. But if we look at the population today, over 25 million so-called black descendants of slaves inhabit these lands. How can this be? The highest concentration of this mislabeled population inhabit the countries of Suriname, Colombia, Guyana, Ecuador, and Brazil, while Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay have little to no black people. In every official narrative during colonialism, all the black people on the continent were escaped slaves who joined with natives and created independent tribes. Many of these people were tagged as Maroons. Many more have been tagged with the Afro moniker. Afro-Peruvian, Afro-Bolivian, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Surinamese, etc. But civilization wasn't new on the continent of South America. Who were the people who built Norte Chico, a civilization in Peru tagged as the oldest in the Americas? Norte Chico, otherwise known as the Corral Supe civilization, was the predecessor to the Incan Empire. According to archaeologists, this massive civilization was contemporaneous with ancient Egypt, but nothing of cultural significance has seemed to last from this civilization, other than entire cities of massive ruins that include roads, high-quality stone masonry, several pyramids, and architecturally advanced complexes of grandiose magnitude. But surprisingly, the experts say these people had no remnants of cultural significance. No history, no pottery, no art. In fact, all DNA studies conducted in these areas and several other areas of South America only include people of the so-called indigenous tribes whom had supplanted these populations in the last 300 years. Archaeological sites abound across the continent, but mysteriously, the so-called indigenous tribes of these areas have no histories connected to the civilizations of antiquity. Take the Quechua and the Aymara people, for example, the indigenous people of Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Chile. These populations are in no relation to the people of the Incan Empire. Unmistakably, these people were subjects to the Inca. After the Spanish conquest of the empire, these people dwelt in their stead, and the Inca became subjects under Spain and Portuguese rule. But as the official narrative goes, the first Africans to this area were brought by Spaniards. But who were these Africans? What the classical narrative proposes is that the entirety of the so-called Black or Afro population, which exceeds even that of North America, is a result of 7 million African slaves brought after the year 1500. But if this were true, who were the natives being captured and turned into slaves during the conquest? Did the Portuguese and the Spaniards capture a Mongol-type indigenous person, then trade them across the sea for Africans, and then ship the Africans back to the Americas? That would seem an unnecessary amount of work when there are plenty Indians here. Before the year 1600, millions of indigenous South Americans had already become under control of European powers, and thousands more had been sold and shipped to Africa and Europe. But let's not forget the Trans-Pacific slave trade, which brought millions of Southeast Asians to the Americas at the very same time. Quote, "Blackbirding involves the coercion of people through deception or kidnapping to work as slaves or poorly paid laborers in countries distant from their native land. The term has been most commonly applied to the large-scale taking of people indigenous to the numerous islands in the Pacific during the 19th and 20th centuries. These blackbirded people were called Kanakas or South Sea Islanders. They were taken from such places as the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Niue, Easter Island, Gilbert Islands, Tuvalu, and the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago, amongst others. In the late 1880s, a worldwide boom in coffee demand fueled the expansion of coffee growing in many regions, including the southwest of Mexico and in neighboring Guatemala. This expansion resulted in local labor shortages for the European plantation owners and managers in these areas. William Forsyth, an Englishman with expert knowledge on tropical plantations, promoted a scheme of recruiting people from the Gilbert Islands to counteract the shortage of workers in Mexico and Guatemala. Captain Luttrell of the vessel Helen W. Almy was chartered and sent out to the Pacific, where he recruited 300 Gilbert Islanders. They were offloaded in Mexico and sent to work at a coffee plantation near Tapachula owned by an American named John McGee. By 1894, despite supposedly having a 3-year contract, none had been returned home and only 58 were still living. In 1891, the Baroque Tahiti, under command of Captain Ferguson, was assigned to bring another load of Gilbert Islanders to Tapachula. This ship acquired around 370 islanders, including about 100 children. While bringing its human cargo to the Americas, The Tahiti suffered storm damage and was forced to anchor in Drake's Bay, north of San Francisco. Amid accusations of slavery and blackbirding, Ferguson transferred the command of the ship to another officer and abandoned the islanders in what amounted to a floating prison. Repairs were delayed for months, and in early 1892, the Tahiti was found capsized, with all but a few survivors drowned to death. Despite this tragedy, another ship, the Montserrat, was fitted out to contact more Gilbert Islanders, this time for coffee plantations in Guatemala. Ferguson again employed, but this time as a recruiter, not as a captain. A journalist aboard the Montserrat described the recruiting of islanders as clear slavery, and even though British naval officers in the region boarded the vessel for inspection, an understanding existed whereby the process was legitimized. The Montserrat sailed to Guatemala with about 470 islanders, and once disembarked, they were sold for $100 each and force marched 70 miles to the plantations in the highlands. Overwork and disease killed about 200 of them. Approximately 1,200 Gilbert Islanders were recruited in 3 shiploads for the Mexican and Guatemalan coffee plantations. Only 250 survived, most of these being returned to their homeland in 2 voyages in 1896 and 1908. This represented a mortality rate of 80%. End quote. Yet and still, the Spanish exported an unaccounted for amount of Southeast Asians from the moment they conquered the Philippines in the 16th century. And let's not forget about the Chinese, who were brought to Peru for labor in the mid-1800s and are currently 5% of the population. Each Spanish-Portuguese vagabond was filled with the glorious expectation for manifest destiny. The men embarked with visions of gold and riches, or at the very least, captured natives who could be used as free labor to build infrastructure, or simply merchandise to sell. It's even documented that Columbus himself negotiated the sale of 4,000 American indigenous captives into the elite families of Portugal and Spain before the year 1500. With just this information alone, we can expect, at the very least, the transport of the like amount of captives across the board, especially taking into account the hundreds, if not thousands, of Spaniards and Portuguese who were selling indigenous captives. Which means, at minimum, 500,000 to 1 million indigenous Americans were taken to Africa and Europe before the official begin of the so-called African slave trade that began in 1619. The genetic makeup of the significant population of indigenous people on the continent was unmistakably of a Negro phenotype. The so-called people mislabeled as Afro are in fact the original inhabitants of the land that was being invaded from all 4 corners. A true historical analysis of the record will clearly show that the dominant pre-Columbian civilization on the South American continent was the Incan Empire during the time of colonization. This empire lasted until the early 1700s and was ruled by so-called black people. Yet, at the very same time, the record also shows that the powers in Europe were also ruled by black people. Were these the very same black people? Of course, the term black person is a socio-racial misclassification essentially designed to lump darker races of people into the same category, pigeonholing this population into an African or slavery-connected identity. These methods of rhetorical social classification were used to create a caste system and to conflate the identity of a free Indian and a captive. Slavery would be the perfect mechanism to execute this deception. The idea of race in general is at the heart of this deception, because we know for a fact that dark-skinned Moors and Moranos were some of the first conquistadors, and these conquistadors even traveled across the Atlantic with African mariners. One of these Africans, Juan Garrido, aka Handsome John, was a conquistador from the Congo, as cited by several sources. Also, Pedro Alonso Niño, who was supposedly the captain for Columbus during his first expedition. Although neither of these two men's expeditions led them into inland South America, there was a well-established practice of hiring many North African and Moroccan navigators as agents across the sea. Much of this intercontinental cooperation was a result of the fact that the Portuguese had conquered Ghana in 1479, just 15 years before the infamous discovery. In theory, this event facilitated the opening of the gates to the West. If the elite families in Europe were black, why did they create a caste system based upon color? Could it be that even to this day, the world is being run by a secret group of black people? How is it that the Spanish brought millions of South Asians to South and Central America, but they are not included in the slave trade narrative? Were these people slaves or indentured servants? How could Ferdinand Magellan have been the first man to circumnavigate the globe when he was killed before the complete trip? When the Moors were expelled from Spain in 1491, where did they go? And what role do they play in the slave trade? Which families from the Genesis Table of Nations do these people represent? Better yet, who are the families from the Table of Nations do the people of America represent? If the Indigenous American represents the line of Shem, would that be the line of Peleg or Joktan? Genesis chapter 36 says, Esau intermarried with the Canaanites, and the sons of Esau were called dukes. So does that mean all the royal dukes in Europe are sons of Esau? If this is true, then all of the most powerful families of Italy, Spain, France, England, Ireland, and Germany are sons of Esau. In reality, this is all bloodlines intermingled together for the purposes of running the world. How did a black people turn into white people? Are these people new, or did they already exist? If they already did exist, where is the certified historical account of these people before the year 1500? If white people didn't exist 500 years ago, what's to account for all the Greco-Roman, medieval, Renaissance art? Does that mean their entire history is fake? The answer to these questions and more on the next episode of The Smartest Beast in the Field.